The alarm screamed through the mining colony at 442B like a dying animal. Captain Daniel Harper jerked awake in his quarters, his hand reaching for the wall panel before his eyes were fully open. Red lights flashed across the metal surfaces, casting everything in the color of blood. He stumbled into his uniform and moved fast toward the command center. The corridors were already filling with people. Workers in jumpsuits ran past him, their faces tight with fear. Somewhere deep in the station, the emergency klaxon kept its relentless wail. The command center was chaos wrapped in controlled motion. Screens showed data streaming in from every sensor the colony had. Daniel pushed through the crowd of technicians and found Dr. Lisa Grant standing before the main display, her arms crossed hard against her chest. "Report," Daniel said. Lisa didn't turn. She stared at the sensor readings like they might change if she looked hard enough. "We have a problem, Captain, a big one." The main screen showed something Daniel had never seen before. It was not a ship. It was not a weapon. It was a wall of pure energy tearing through space toward them, and it was big enough to swallow a city. "What is it?" Daniel asked. "We do not know yet," said a voice from the communications station. The speaker was a liaison officer assigned to the human colony 3 months ago. They were one of the oldest species in known space, and they had advanced technology that made human engineering look like children playing with sticks. But space showed something Daniel had never seen on an alien before: fear. "The Council just sent an emergency broadcast," continued. His four-fingered hands moved across the console. "They call it a void storm. It appears once every few hundred years in different parts of the galaxy. Nothing stops it. Nothing survives it." Daniel felt ice move down his spine. "How long until it reaches us?" 72 hours, Lisa said finally. She turned to face him. Her eyes were solid steel. "Maybe less." Daniel looked at the sensor data. The storm was moving fast, tearing space itself as it went. The readings made no sense. The energy signature did not match anything in the human database. The storm was not expanding or shrinking. It was just moving with purpose, like something alive was driving it forward. "Evacuation options?" Daniel asked. "We have 4 transport ships," Lisa said. "They can hold maybe half the colony if we pack them tight. We have 743 people here." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. 743 people. More than half would have to stay behind. More than half would die. "Start the evacuation," he said. "Load the essential personnel first, medical staff, engineers, the research teams." "The rest?" Lisa asked. "Get as many as we can on the ships," Daniel said. "We have 3 days to figure out what we can do." But even as he said it, he knew the truth. There was nothing they could do. They had warned that no species had ever survived a void storm. They were older than human civilization by millions of years, and they ran from these things like everything else did. Daniel turned and walked out of the command center. He needed to think. He needed air that did not taste like fear and recycled oxygen. He moved through the corridors toward the observation deck. The observation deck was empty. Through the transparent aluminum panels, the stars shone cold and distant. 442B hung below them like a rust-colored marble, beautiful and terrible at the same time. This was home now. It had been home for 5 years. "I thought I would find you here." Daniel turned. His daughter Sophie stood in the doorway, still wearing her engineer's coveralls. She was tall and lean, with the same dark hair as her mother had. Daniel's chest tightened when he looked at her. "How did you hear?" he asked. "Everyone heard," Sophie said. "The alarm reached the lower levels. People are scared, Dad. They are asking what we are going to do." Daniel gestured at the planet below. "We are going to evacuate who we can. We are going to hope that the transport ships are fast enough." Sophie walked to the window and stood beside him. She did not speak for a long time. When she finally did, her voice was quiet and steady. "You are not going to leave, are you?" "Someone needs to stay with the colony operations," Daniel said. It was not a full answer, and Sophie knew it. "You are not going to leave," she said again. It was not a question this time. Daniel looked at his daughter. She was 23 years old and one of the best engineers in the colony. She had dreams. She had a future she was supposed to live. "I cannot leave," he said. "The evacuation needs to be coordinated. Someone needs to run the systems, keep communications open as long as possible." Sophie turned away from the window. Her eyes were dark and angry. "Then I am staying too." "No," Daniel said. The word came out hard as a stone. "You are getting on one of those ships and you are going to live." "My skills are better than anyone else in engineering," Sophie shot back. "If you are staying to run the systems, then you need someone who understands the deep infrastructure. You need me." "You are getting on that ship," Daniel repeated. Sophie's jaw clenched. She turned back to the window without answering. They stood in silence while the stars looked down on them and the void storm moved closer through the darkness. Back in the command center, Lisa was already organizing the evacuation. Transport ships were being fueled. Personnel lists were being sorted and resorted, trying to fit too many people into too few seats. They had sent more information about the void storm, but the data was not helpful. Its 70 hours passed like hours do not normally pass. They moved slow and terrible, each minute heavy as stone. The colony worked without sleep. Transport ships were loaded with supplies and people. The personnel list was finalized 3 times, then changed again because someone always made the decision to give their seat to someone else. Daniel did not sleep. He stayed in the command center and watched the sensor feeds. The void storm grew larger with every passing hour. Its edges twisted and bent, forming shapes that looked almost like faces before dissolving into chaos again. The energy readings climbed higher and higher. Nothing the colony's instruments measured made sense. The liaison officer had sent additional warnings. The storm would hit the outer defense stations first. Then it would spread inward. The colony had maybe 4 hours once the outer stations detected the leading edge before the main force arrived. Sophie came into the command center at hour 68. Daniel was too tired to argue with her about the evacuation. He just let her sit at the engineer's station and monitor the power systems. Her presence was a comfort and a pain at the same time. "The generators are stable," Sophie said, looking at her displays. "Backup systems are ready. If we redistribute power from the residential sectors, we can keep the command center and defense grid active for maybe 12 hours after the initial strike." Daniel nodded. 12 hours. Maybe that was enough time for something. He did not know what, but the word hope was still alive in his chest, even if it was barely breathing. At hour 71, the outer sensors started picking up the storm's leading edge. It looked like a wall of lightning mixed with something darker, something that ate light instead of giving it off. The defense stations began firing everything they had into the approaching wall. Missiles, plasma charges, kinetic strikes, everything bounced off or passed through the storm as if the weapons were harmless. "It is absorbing the energy," a technician shouted. "All of it, every shot makes it stronger." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. That was not supposed to happen. Energy weapons were supposed to damage things, destroy things, push them back. But the void storm was feeding on the attacks like a hungry animal. The first defense station disappeared from the sensors at hour 72. Not destroyed, not disabled, gone. One moment it was registering on every screen, the next it simply ceased to exist. 350 human beings died in that moment, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. "Cut all weapons fire," Daniel ordered. "All stations go dark, do not fire on the storm again." "But Captain," a weapons officer started to protest. "The weapons are making it stronger," Daniel said. "Go dark now." The colony fell silent. No more firing, no more resistance, just watching as the void storm came closer and closer. The transport ships launched at hour 73. 4 ships, packed with people who wanted to live, who had families and dreams and reasons to survive. Sophie watched them launch from the viewport, her face expressionless. Daniel knew what she was thinking. They were leaving her behind. The outer section of the colony was hit next. The collision was not like an explosion. It was like a hole was being torn in reality itself. The outer section just stopped existing. Corridors that had connected to other corridors were suddenly leading to nothing. The vacuum did not rush in because there was nothing there to rush into. Just absence, just emptiness. Alarms screamed through the inner sections. "Reroute all power to the central core," Daniel commanded. "Lock down all internal bulkheads. We are going to make a stand here." 200 people remained in the colony. Technicians, engineers, medical staff, and a handful of others who had chosen to stay and help with the evacuation coordination. They moved together into the central core, a fortified section deep inside the mountain that the colony was built into. Sophie worked alongside them, her hands moving fast across the power distribution panels. She was crying, but she did not stop working. She did not slow down. She kept her focus on the screens in front of her. "The storm is touching the inner perimeter," Lisa said from her station. 20 minutes until impact on the main compound." The void storm surrounded the colony now, visible through every viewport. It looked like the sky itself was tearing apart. The air turned colors that did not have names. Purple and green, and something that was not quite black but darker than anything Daniel had ever seen. When the main compound was hit, the power systems went crazy. Screens flickered. Lights exploded in showers of sparks. The walls shook like something impossible was pressing against them. Alarms reached a pitch so high they seemed to belong to another universe. But the mountain held. The central core held. The void storm could not penetrate stone and metal and human will combined into one solid thing. Sophie looked at her father. Her eyes were steady now. The fear was still there, but underneath it was something stronger, determination, focus. The same thing Daniel had seen in his own mirror that morning. "We are still here," she said. "We are still here," Daniel agreed. The storm raged against the mountain for hours. The colony's sensors slowly went dark one by one as the system was overwhelmed by readings it could not process. But the central core remained. The power stayed on. The barriers held. And in the darkness and chaos of the void storm, Daniel realized something important. They had said that nothing survived the void storm. They had said that everything was destroyed. But they had measured destruction in one way: extinction, death. They had not counted on humanity's definition of survival. Not winning. Not winning was survival. Lasting 5 more hours was survival. Keeping the systems running 1 more minute was survival. Looking your daughter in the eye while the universe fell apart around you and still believing that there was a way forward. That was survival too. "Dad," Sophie said quietly, "what do we do now?" Daniel looked at the data still streaming in from the surviving sensors. He looked at his daughter. He looked at the Sophie's fingers flew across the keyboard. The central core of the colony had one advantage that nothing else did. It had access to every database that the mining operation had accumulated over 5 years of settlement. Medical records, geological surveys, scientific research, equipment specifications. All of it was here, stored in hardened servers that were still functioning. "The storm has a pattern," Sophie said. Her voice was steady despite the way the whole compound shook around them. The void storm was still pressing against the mountain, still tearing at the stone, but stone was patient. Stone did not break in minutes or hours. Stone broke across centuries. Maybe they had that long, maybe they did not. Daniel leaned over her shoulder. Streams of data filled the screen. Energy readings, frequency measurements, harmonic wavelengths that the colony's sensors had been recording as the storm approached. "Look," Sophie pointed at a graph that showed the storm's energy signature over time. "It is not random. The pattern repeats every 7.3 seconds. It is like a wave, like sound, like a frequency." A technician named approached from the communications station. He was young, only 19, and his hands were shaking. "Captain, I found something in the archived messages. It came from a research vessel that passed through this region about 230 years ago." Pulled up an old data file. The text was in script, but the colony's translation software converted it to English as they read. "They studied the void storm," read. "They said the phenomenon operates on a specific energy wavelength. They attempted to analyze it, but they could not approach close enough without the storm absorbing their ship's power. They had one theory: if an opposing frequency could be generated, it might disrupt the storm's coherence. They might not stop it, but they could weaken it. They could create an opening." Sophie and Daniel exchanged a look. Disrupt the storm's coherence. Create an opening. That was not victory, but it was not surrender either. It was something. "Can we generate an opposing frequency?" Daniel asked. Sophie was already calculating. Her hands moved across the keyboard. Numbers and equations filled a secondary screen. She had learned engineering from her father, and she had inherited his ability to see solutions in problems. But this was beyond anything she had worked on before. This was trying to challenge a force that the oldest civilizations in the galaxy feared. "The power requirement would be massive," Sophie said. "Exponential. To generate a frequency strong enough to affect the storm at the scale we are dealing with, we would need to channel power through the colony's entire system. We would need to amplify it. We would need to transmit it at exactly the right wavelength at exactly the right moment. Can it be done? Daniel asked. Sophie looked away from her screen. She looked at the viewport where the void storm tore at the mountains outside. She looked back at her father. Yes, she said, but not like this, not from here. We would need someone to take a portable transmitter directly into the storm's perimeter, close enough to activate it, close enough for the frequency to reach the storm's core. The words hung in the air between them. Daniel understood what his daughter was not saying. Someone would have to go outside. Someone would have to face the void storm directly. Someone would have to enter that wall of energy and activate a device that they had no guarantee would work. Sophie's hand was shaking now, but her voice stayed level. When I was born, the doctors told you something. They told you I had a condition. They told you I would not survive to be 15 years old. Daniel's throat tightened. He had never told Sophie about the original diagnosis. He had kept it secret for all these years. I heard Mom talking to you once, Sophie continued. When I was 12, you did not know I was listening. She said that I was stronger than the doctors thought. She said that humans had a way of surviving things that were not supposed to be survivable. She said that was what being human meant. Sophie, Daniel said. You taught me that, she said. You taught me that when something cannot be done, you find another way. When something is impossible, you make it possible through stubbornness and will and refusal to accept the end. She turned to face him fully. There were tears in her eyes, but they were not tears of fear. They were tears of anger and determination and love all mixed together. I am going into that storm, Dad. I am going to carry that transmitter, and I am going to activate it, and I am going to survive it because I have been surviving things my whole life. Because humans survive. Daniel's hands clenched. Every instinct he had wanted to say no, wanted to protect his daughter, wanted to keep her safe the way he had always tried to keep her safe. But he thought about his wife. He thought about what she would say if she were here. He thought about Sophie at 15 years old, playing in the colony gardens, alive and breathing and existing in the world when she was supposed to be dead. No, he said. The word came out harder than steel. Sophie's face fell. Dad, you said we figure out how to fight back. We fight back, we do not give up. You are not fighting, Daniel said. Someone else is. Someone is going to take that transmitter into the storm. Someone is going to die, but it is not going to be you. He turned away before Sophie could argue further. He moved toward the equipment room where they kept the survival suits. The suits were designed for extreme environments. Radiation, vacuum, temperatures that would kill an unprotected human in seconds. They were not designed for the void storm. Nothing was designed for that, but they were the best chance anyone had. I will go, said from behind him. I can carry the device. Airlock doors hissed open. Daniel stepped through in his survival suit, and the wind that was not quite wind but something worse picked him up and threw him sideways. He caught himself against the metal frame. Behind him, the inner airlock sealed. Sophie watched from the control room window above. He did not let himself look at her. The void storm was everywhere. It surrounded the mountain like an ocean of liquid darkness. The sky itself had been torn apart, revealing something underneath. Something that was not space. Something that was not anything that Daniel had words for. The frequency transmitter was a cylinder about the size of his forearm, made of reinforced polymer and shielded to protect its sensitive components. Sophie and the technical team had built it in 2 hours, working with precision that spoke to their refusal to accept failure. It weighed 5 kilos. It felt like it weighed 1,000. Daniel clipped the transmitter to his suit and began walking toward the storm's edge. Every step was harder than the one before. The air around him was growing thinner and hotter at the same time. His suit reported rising radiation levels. His suit reported temperatures that should be impossible. The void storm did not destroy things the way explosions did. It erased them. It unmade them at a level that reality could not accept. The rocks beneath Daniel's feet were turning to dust. The metal frame of the colony compound was simply ceasing to exist. He was walking into a place where the rules of existence were being rewritten. His radio crackled. It was Sophie's voice, thin and electronic, coming from the command center. Dad, your vitals are critical. Come back now. Daniel kept walking. He could feel his consciousness beginning to fracture. The void storm was not just energy. It was something else, something almost alive. It was trying to unmake him the way it unmade everything else. "I cannot come back," he said into the radio. His voice sounded strange to his own ears. "You know I cannot." There was a long silence. Then Sophie said, "I know. Activate the transmitter in 40 seconds. You will need to be at the coordinates I sent to your display." Daniel looked at his suit's display. Coordinates were blinking there, marking the exact center of the storm's approach. The center of the darkness. The place where the void storm was strongest. He kept walking. The ground beneath his feet was gone now. He was walking through air that was not air, standing on nothing that was something. His suit's internal systems were beginning to fail. The neural implant that connected him to his technology was degrading. He could feel the connections breaking down, one by one. He thought about Sophie. He thought about his wife who had believed that humans could survive anything. He thought about every person he had ever known who had chosen to stand firm when they could have run away. That was the real strength, not weapons, not shields, not technology. The real strength was the choice to face the darkness when the darkness came. 20 seconds. Daniel reached into his suit's storage pocket and pulled out a small object, a photograph. It was faded and creased from being carried for years. It showed Sophie as a child, maybe 5 years old, standing in the colony gardens with flowers in her hair. Behind her was her mother, smiling. Behind them both was the rust-colored sky of 442B. The void storm tried to take the photograph away. It tried to unmake it like it unmade everything else, but Daniel held it tight. 10 seconds. He reached the coordinates. The storm raged around him. His vision was fragmenting. His mind was starting to disconnect from his body, but his hands still worked. Humans were stubborn things. Human hands kept working even when the rest was falling apart. He activated the transmitter. The device hummed. It was a small sound, almost gentle in the midst of the void storm's roar. The frequency started to pulse out. It was not something that could be heard. It was something that existed at a level beneath hearing, a vibration at the heart of reality itself. The void storm recoiled. Not in pain, not because it was destroyed, but in something like recognition. Something was pushing back. For the first time in the void storm's existence, something was fighting. The barrier that had seemed immovable began to crack. Sophie watched the displays from the command center. All around her, monitors showed the storm's pattern beginning to disintegrate. The wave that had seemed eternal was beginning to collapse in on itself. "It is working," said, his voice shaking with disbelief. "It is actually working." But Sophie was not watching the data. She was watching the viewport. She was watching the point in the void storm where her father had gone. His suit's signal was fading. His vitals had flatlined 5 minutes ago. His life signs were gone. But the transmitter was still broadcasting. The frequency was still strong. The counterwave was still pushing back against the void storm. Daniel Harper did not feel his suit fail. He did not feel the moment when his body began to unmake itself. His last conscious thought was of his daughter, alive and brilliant, and refusing to give up even when the universe was telling her to surrender. His last action was sending a final message through the neural implant as it broke down. "I am sorry I can't see you graduate, but I know you'll do impossible things. That's where you come from." The message came through broken and fragmentary in the command center, but Sophie heard every word. She heard her father's voice, stretched and distorted by the failing systems, speaking to her one last time. The void storm began to collapse. It did not happen all at once. It was not a sudden explosion or a dramatic finale. It was a slow implosion, like a wound closing. The energy that had been tearing reality apart began to fold in on itself. The darkness began to retreat. The transmitter kept broadcasting. After 10 minutes, the void storm was gone. The sky over 442B was visible again. Rust-colored 6 months passed after the void storm was pushed back. The evacuation ships returned to 442B with supplies and personnel to begin the rebuilding. The colony had lost half of its structures. All of its outer facilities were gone. The mountain had been by forces that no earthly engineering could withstand. But the mountain still stood. Sophie Harper led the first survey team into the devastated landscape. She wore her father's coat over her environmental suit. It was an old habit. When she was scared, she put on her father's coat. She had put it on so many times in her life that the fabric had worn smooth in places. The search teams moved through the ruins looking for bodies. They found parts of the colony that no longer made sense. corridors that ended in nothing, rooms that had been erased down to their foundations. The void storm had not been kind in its retreat. But they did not find Captain Daniel Harper's body. What they found instead was the transmitter, still partially operational, still pulsing with the ghost of the frequency it had broadcast. It was partially buried in the stone near the coordinates where Sophie had sent her father. Around it, the rock was fused into patterns that looked almost like reaching hands. Sophie knelt beside the device and pulled it free from the stone. It was warm. It should not have been warm, not after 6 months, but it was. She held it to her chest and did not let anyone see her cry. 2 months later, Sophie was promoted to captain. At the age of 23, she took command of the 442B colony. The position was normally filled by someone with decades of experience, but there was no one else. And more than that, the colony needed her. She had been the one who had fought against the impossible and lived. She had been the one who had helped her father stand firm when everything was falling apart. The other evacuation ships had continued their journey deeper into human space. They carried the story with them. The story of the void storm. The story of a colony that refused to surrender. The story of Captain Daniel Harper, who had walked into the darkness alone and never came back. The council heard the story too. 1 year after the void storm collapsed, a diplomatic vessel entered human space. It was carrying representatives of the ancient civilization. They requested an audience with Captain Sophie Harper. They wanted to understand how humans had accomplished what they thought was impossible. Sophie stood before the council in a chamber made of materials that human science did not have names for. She wore her uniform. She carried her father's watch. She had their full attention. "The void storm is one of the oldest threats that we have encountered," the lead said. Its voice was deep and resonated with harmonics. "Our species has faced it for millions of years. We have learned only one strategy. We flee. We abandon our settlements. We run and hope that we outrun it. Nothing else has ever worked." Sophie felt every eye in the chamber on her. Thousands of years of history pressing down on the moment. "Humanity faced it once," she said, keeping her voice steady. "We did not have time to flee. We did not have the technology that you have. We did not have the knowledge or experience. We had nothing except a refusal to surrender." She pulled out the transmitter. It was still intact. She had repaired it carefully and kept it safe. It was all that remained of her father except for memory. "My father taught me that the strength of humanity is not found in weapons," Sophie continued. "It is not found in shields or walls or technology. It is found in the willingness of one person to stand firm when the rest of the world is falling apart. It is found in the choice to protect those you love, even when it costs everything." She held up the watch. This man, Captain Daniel Harper, stood alone against the void storm. He knew he would not survive. He went forward anyway, not because he was brave, not because he was special, but because he was human, because that is what humans do when darkness comes. We stand, we choose, we love, and we refuse to let the darkness win without a fight. The council was silent for a very long time. Finally, the lead spoke again. "We have studied the energy signatures from the void storm's collapse. According to our calculations, the counter-frequency that your father generated should not have worked. The power requirements alone should have been impossible to achieve, yet you managed it. How?" Sophie thought about her father in his survival suit, walking toward the storm with its energy tearing at reality itself. She thought about the choice he had made, the sacrifice he had offered. "We did it because we had nothing left to lose," she said simply. "When you have nothing left to lose, anything becomes possible, because humans have always survived by refusing to accept the end. We bend, we break, but we do not surrender." The council voted unanimously that day. They would invest in understanding human capabilities. They would include humanity in their highest councils. They would study the human capacity for sacrifice and determination, and what they were beginning to understand was humanity's greatest strength. The will to survive not through technology or superiority, but through the choice to stand firm. 2 weeks later, Sophie returned to 442B. She stood on the observation deck where she had stood with her father 1 year ago, watching the stars and knowing that disaster was coming. She placed the transmitter on a pedestal made of stone from the mountain that had protected them. She had modified it. Now it pulsed regularly like a heartbeat, like a light in the darkness. "Every year," she said to the colony workers who had gathered around her, "we will remember. We will remember the people we lost. We will remember Captain Daniel Harper who chose to stand alone. We will remember that when the darkness comes, humans do not surrender. We find another way. We do the impossible. We refuse to accept the end. She placed her hand on the transmitter. It was still warm. It would always be warm, she thought. As long as people remembered, it would stay warm. As long as people chose to stand firm against the darkness, that light would keep pulsing. My father told me once, Sophie said, her voice clear and strong, that being human meant choosing to protect those you love, even when it costs everything. Today, we honor that choice. Today, we remember that one man's sacrifice became all of humanity's hope. The crowd stood in silence as the transmitter pulsed, as the light that had been bought with a man's life continued to shine in the darkness. Sophie looked up at the stars above 442b. Somewhere out in that darkness was her father, somewhere in the space between spaces, in the void that he had chosen to face. But his light remained. His light would always remain. And humanity would never forget that they were the species that fought when the rest of the universe ran. They were the species that stood alone against the impossible. They were the species that loved deeply enough to die for it. They were human, and humans do not surrender. The transmitter pulsed on, broadcasting its gentle frequency to the stars. A beacon, a memorial, a promise. The void storm never returned to 442b. And when the history of the galaxy was written, it would record that on this planet, one man became the light that saved worlds. And his name was Daniel Harper, and he was human. And clear and utterly normal. Sophie sat at her console and stared at the empty space where her father's signal had been. Around her, people were cheering. They had survived. Against impossible odds, humanity had survived. But the cost had been written in one man's sacrifice. Sophie closed her eyes and held the memory of her father's voice, and she made a promise to the universe that she would make his death matter. She would make his sacrifice count for something. She would do impossible things. Because that is where she came from. No, Daniel said. You have family on the evacuation ships. You will stay here and help with the frequency calibration. Lisa Grant stood watching from her station. She understood what was happening. She had known from the moment Sophie suggested the plan that Daniel would not let her daughter be the sacrifice. I will go, Lisa said quietly. Daniel paused. Lisa was a good woman, a smart woman, but she was also the most qualified person they had to maintain the colony systems if something unexpected happened. You will stay, Daniel said. You will keep this place running. You will make sure Sophie has everything she needs to refine that frequency. You will do what you do best. You will survive. Daniel looked at the survival suit hanging on the wall. It was white and marked with colony insignias. It was the suit of someone who took precautions, someone who believed in survival. He reached out and took it down. The void storm raged against the mountain, and Captain Daniel Harper began to prepare for his final walk. Possible storm tearing the world apart outside their metal walls. Now, he said, we figure out how to fight back. How'd only that the storm had destroyed 3 other colonies in the past 1,000 years. All 3 were completely erased. The colony had 3 days to prepare for the end of the world. 3 days to say goodbye to homes that would not exist after the storm passed. 3 days to choose who would live and who would stay behind. Daniel stood in the command center and watched his people face their final choice. He thought about Sophie standing in the observation deck with tears in her eyes. He thought about his wife, dead for 5 years, and how she had always believed that humans could survive anything if they were stubborn enough. The void storm moved closer through the dark, and no one in the colony knew that their survival would depend on one man willing to stand alone against the impossible. The alarm kept screaming, the red lights kept flashing, and the void storm tore the sky apart as it came.